Ba-doo-be-doo.
Ba-ba-ba-ba-doo-be-doo-be. 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 When the snow falls outside, you can hold me tight. When it's cold through the night, we'll stay warm inside. We'll feel the fire burning, baby. Spin that record one more time, 'cause we're gonna spend our night dancing in Christmas style.
Born to raise the sons of earth, born to give them second birth. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King.
Well, it's the morning of December 26th, and that means Christmas is officially over. Now, I don't know about you, but I have really enjoyed being a part of this series that we've called The Exchange. We've explored this reality that Christians have to carefully navigate our dual approach to Christmas. The fun and the nostalgia of the secular side, it's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with enjoying cocoa and candy canes and watching Rudolph. We just have to be careful that the images on that side of Christmas don't mess up our understanding of the message on the sacred side, particularly when it comes to gifts. We've explored the reality that how the world gives gifts at Christmas is not the same as how God gives us His gift. With God, there is an exchange. He grants us new life, but He expects us to surrender ours in the exchange. And then we have to share the gift with others. And there's one last part to this series that we need to look at today. And in this exchange, we're going to call it the return. It's kind of appropriate that we're actually talking about this here on December 26th. I mean, if yesterday was to celebrate the spirit of giving gifts, well, today for many, it's going to be to celebrate the returning of those exact same gifts. In fact, according to the National Retail Federation, last year consumers returned an estimated $428 billion in merchandise. That was $428 billion with a B. And when it comes to the holiday season specifically, retailers predict that this year there will be an almost 15% return in merchandise at an estimated cost of nearly $101 billion. Again, that's just for the Christmas season. And this is true for every single area of purchasing: auto parts, apparel, housewares, you name it. Now, granted, there's nothing wrong with you returning that sweater that your mom gave you, thinking that you still the same way you did back in high school. Heads up, you don't. And of course, there's no reason to keep that bed for a cat that your aunt gave you, especially considering your cat died in 1998 and you haven't seen one since. But for many people, returning a gift, it's more about failed expectations than anything else. In fact, consumer research suggests that one of the main reasons people return gifts is that the item did not do what the person receiving it thought it was supposed to. That new camera didn't make the photos look any better. That cookbook didn't make the meals any tastier. And that treadmill you got, it didn't actually help you lose weight like you thought. Plainly put, the gift failed expectations, and so as a result, people return them.
Sadly, the same thing happens with faith. You see, lots of people, believe it or not, they return their faith. As a matter of fact, recently, numerous Christian leaders have openly renounced their faith despite being strong leaders in the church for many years. And this isn't new. The author of Hebrews experienced this as well. He wrote that people who had experienced God's grace ended up leaving the faith. And the same thing occurred with Jesus as well. You see, large crowds would surround Jesus when he was performing miracles or providing for what people wanted. But when he began calling them to a deeper commitment, the scripture records that many of them quit following him. Why? Well, because what they wanted from Jesus, what they expected, had changed. And they no longer saw their selfish desires being met. You know, the Apostle Paul also spoke of people who were partnering with him in ministry only to desert the faith because it did not offer what the world could. In other words, they started out loving God, but when their expectations weren't met, they returned in the exchange for what the world was marketing to them. So you see, this gift that God offers can be treated like some of the gifts we get at Christmas. If we're not careful, we can become disillusioned with it. And this happens when we enter this exchange with God with the wrong expectations. You see, if we come to God only for what he can do for us rather than what he truly came for, we set ourselves up for the possibility that we too might mistakenly return our faith out of a feeling of disappointment. But understand, that doesn't mean that God's gift has failed us. It means that we had a wrong understanding of it. And that is what we have to be careful of. We must never see God's gift in the same way we think of earthly gifts. God's gift isn't something we get under the tree. It isn't something that we can tangibly hold. It's not wrapped in paper. It doesn't come in different sizes. But it is and always will be the greatest gift that anyone could ever receive.
It's not under a tree. No, it's not a present wrapped. And it's not an earthly thing. I can't hold it in my hands. Keeps me warmer than a fire on the coldest Christmas Eve. And it doesn't have a price. It's something given free. It's the greatest gift. It's the greatest gift.
So how do we avoid failed expectations? How do we avoid having our own crisis of faith? And how do we make sure that we too don't end up disappointed with God or disappointed with the church or what we thought was salvation? And the answer is this: to make sure that we open the gift for all the right reasons at the very start. And believe it or not, an incredible example is given to us inside the actual Christmas story in Luke's gospel. Luke details the account of the parents of John the Baptist, a man named Zacharias and his wife Elizabeth. And this couple would become so instrumental in the life of Jesus because their son would usher back the prophetic voice of God after 400 years of silence. It would be their son who would ready the people for Jesus' arrival by showing them that God was speaking again. And it would be their son that would actually baptize Jesus and initiate his ministry. In other words, through the faithful lives of Zacharias and Elizabeth, the pathway would be set for the Messiah, for Jesus to arrive. So I guess they were probably pretty important people, right? The kind of people that God would fill with all sorts of incredible blessings. Well, not quite so. As a matter of fact, if there was ever two people in Scripture who had the right to be disillusioned by their faith, it was them. If there was ever two people who could claim failed expectations, it would be them. And if anyone could argue that they should be allowed to return the faith, man, it would be Zachariah and Elizabeth. So let's take a moment and look at their story.
Luke opens the Christmas narrative with this detail. He says that during the reign of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah, and he belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. And he had a wife named Elizabeth, and she was a descendant of Aaron. Now, there's a small detail here that a lot of people miss. Not only was Zechariah a priest selected by God to minister in the temple, but his wife was also a descendant of a priestly family. And that's why Luke intentionally states that she was a descendant of Aaron. I mean, in Jewish culture, that was considered to be an incredibly special blessing. It'd be like the daughter of one of our presidents marrying the son of another president, or a prince in Great Britain finding a wife who was also royalty. For Zechariah and Elizabeth, their entire heritage was a family line of people serving God. I mean, truly, that would be something that God would honor, right? But then Luke continues to build on their resume in the next verse when he writes this. He says that they were both righteous in the sight of God, following all the commandments and the ordinances of the Lord blamelessly. Now, why include this statement? Well, because Luke wants you to know that they did not lean on their heritage as the strength of their faith. They did not assume that on the basis of lineage that God was going to bless them. Instead, they genuinely lived a life of righteousness. They actually followed God's law. They practiced what they preached. I mean, they were, in short, what we would call the real deal. These were people who had the DNA of righteousness, but then they actually proved it through their everyday lives. So again, just think about this. If God would bless anyone, I mean, he'd bless them, right? If not for their ancestry, then for their obedience. I mean, if two people deserve to get some form of spiritual reward, if two people had a right to have some expectations about their faith, it was them.
But then Luke writes this: but they did not have a child because Elizabeth was barren and they were both very old. Listen, there's no way to overstate this, and there's no way to exaggerate the disappointment this must have brought to this wonderful couple. You see, to be childless in any culture can bring a couple great grief, but this was especially true in the Jewish culture. For starters, the call to have children, to be fruitful and multiply, was God's original command to mankind. To have a family was seen as fulfilling God's desire for humanity. But more than just a responsibility, it was also seen as a blessing. That's exactly how the scriptures of Moses records God's word. It doesn't say that God commanded them to have children, but rather that God blessed them with children. You see, children are a blessing from God. And that truth was woven all throughout the Bible. As the psalmist writes, children are a heritage from the Lord. Offsprings are a reward from him. You hear that? Children are a reward from God. That's what the scriptures proclaimed. And that's the very same scriptures that Zechariah and Elizabeth were the priest over. You have to wonder, how many times do you suppose that Zechariah had to unroll the scroll and read that passage aloud to the people as a priest? And all the while trying to figure out, why was God not rewarding him? Again, these were the same people who had the right lineage. They were the people who did all the right things. And yet, God did not return to them any of the kind of rewards that they might have expected to receive. Instead, he not only allowed Elizabeth to remain physically unable to have children, but he allowed her to grow old enough that it wasn't even a hope for a child at that point. I wonder how she felt. I imagine there was times where she was incredibly disappointed. Why? Well, because later, when she would become pregnant, she would state that God had been gracious to her by taking away her disgrace among the people. Wow. Think about that for a second. Hear that. She felt disgraced all of these years. Why would she feel that way? Because in a culture where children are deemed a reward from God for righteous living, the absence of a child was often seen as God's punishment. And people may not have said that to Elizabeth, but they probably thought it. And it was probably whispered when she wasn't around. And people who probably meant well at times probably asked questions. And all of it hurt. It hurt her very deeply.
So let's put two and two together. I think we can safely make a conclusion. Zechariah and Elizabeth had all the right aspects of the faith, and they lived the right way before God. And as a result, there is no question in my mind that they certainly had just some simple expectation of what we would call an ordinary fashion. And that expectation was simply this: God would reward them. Not because they were coming up with that in their own mind, but because that's what God's own word said. But it never happened. And as a result, there were failed expectations. The gift of knowing God was not returning back to them what they had hoped for, at least not up to the start of the narrative. But did they return their faith? Not hardly. Did they leave it, like all the ones that left Jesus or left Paul, or who tasted of the goodness of God only to allow the world to lure them away? Nope. They stayed faithful to the gift. Why? Because they weren't in it for what the gift could give them, but rather because of who the giver was. They didn't follow and serve God for what they could get out of it, but because they understood that God could be trusted. And if there were failed expectations, they understood that it didn't mean that God had failed. It just meant that expectations were likely in need of adjustment. Listen, when it comes to our earthly Christmas gifts, we all know what it's like to not get what we were hoping for, right? I mean, we really wanted that new computer or the gaming console, and instead we had to open a package of socks. Or maybe we were really hoping for a new watch or an iPhone, and we had to fake that Christmas smile to open up a book or a sweater instead. Or maybe you actually got what you hoped for, but it failed to meet the hype of the advertisement. And in all those cases, what are you going to do? Well, you're likely to return the gift for something else. But with the faith, you can't allow failed expectations to do the same to you. You can't allow any form of disappointment to entice you to return the gift of faith for something else. There's that famous phrase that Jesus is the reason for the season. Well, of course, that's true. But the inverse of that is also true. With Jesus, there are seasons for a reason. Of all the imagery used in the scriptures to illustrate the life of faith, none are as prevalent as that of farming and planting. In the same way that there are seasons where a field shows planting and growth, there are also seasons where the field just simply needs to rest for nutrients to be replenished and soil to be enriched. And that's true for the faith. If it seems like nothing is happening or your expectations aren't being met, don't return the gift. Just rest and let God do his work behind the scenes.
Been waiting on a moment, been waiting on a sign, waiting for them to call your name when you're next in line, waiting for your time to come, your 15 minutes in the sun. So don't you find it strange that God, he made 4 seasons and only one spring? So just let the ground rest, 'cause if it's not right now, it's for the best. You're gonna grow, I know this, but for now, just let the ground rest. Waiting on a moment, waiting on a sign, waiting for the lights to change when you won't feel so stuck or so left behind. Been waiting for the day to come when you can leave behind what you've become and wash it all away. 'Cause flowers only grow once they've tasted rain. So just let the ground rest, 'cause if it's not right now, it's for the best. And you're gonna grow, I know this, but for now, just let the ground rest. He'll finish what he starts. He started this, I know. And if you saw the plans, maybe you wouldn't go. I watched him plant a seed and then let the ground rest. So child, oh believe, 'cause I promise there's a harvest.
So 2 quick announcements before we send you on your way. First, coming up the very beginning of the new year is our week of prayer and fasting. And we want to give you some time so you can be planning ahead. Every single night, the first week of January, January 3rd to the 7th, our church is going to be open at 6:45 for you to come together and pray with us. We want you to set aside a time that entire week to recommit yourself to the Lord. And then a special meeting is going to take place on Wednesday, January the 5th, here at the church. That same week of prayer, we're going to come together. There's some exciting things we want to talk to you about. We want to share some vision we have moving forward. You've heard us talk about the Chrisfield Church a little bit. We want to share some of the details with you concerning that. So plan on being a part of us that coming week, and we will look forward to seeing what God's going to do together. God bless you.